Gentlemen, great to see you.
Absolutely. Great to be here.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for dropping by, Evan. It's fantastic to host you hosting us.
Indeed.
I know. I don't know exactly. It's you guys are so good at this that it's an interviewer-interviewee collaboration of sorts.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I'm really glad that we got to be here today. I was so thrilled when I found out about what you both do, and doing it at a national level, and really pushing forth what Meyerside Chats is really intended to create itself. And when I found out about Braver Angels, I was just thrilled that this is going on. And for, just to kind of kick things off, tell me a little bit about what Braver Angels is and what inspired you to be part of this.
Randy, you want to go first, or should I?
I'm happy to lead off.
Yeah, okay.
Coin toss.
Yeah, there you go. So, Braver Angels is an organization, I would say the largest organization in the space that is trying to help Americans come together and transcend the division that we've been really experiencing over the last several years, and that's been getting worse, and help Americans to understand one another rather than just trying to make their point, win the argument. And if we can actually understand one another, then we can help to really build a house united and come and make progress for this country in the way that I think a lot of people are really hungry for, but that they have been so frustrated seeing their leaders, the people in their lives, their friends and family, their neighbors and colleagues, just be unable to have productive discussions about the issues that are really important for them. So in late 2016, we brought together our first workshop. It was roughly equal numbers of Clinton and Trump supporters right after the election. And we did a pilot workshop that gave real structure to the conversation. And it was led by our one of our co-founders, Dr. Bill Doherty, who has a lot of expertise in helping relationships that are in crisis really to move past that and use better communication skills to understand one another. And
he's a professor of psychology at the University of Minnesota and really one of America's foremost family counselors, marriage therapists, essentially. Right. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so from there, that was such a successful experience, such a successful experiment. And so we built an organization based on that. And so that Red Blue Workshop blossomed into many programs. We have skills training workshops, we have debates, we have new programs like Braver Politics and Braver Partners, and there's just so much work blossoming around that, as well as a local network around the country of local alliances that come together to do the work together and sustain relationships so they can really understand one another and help this country move forward.
Yeah. Yeah, indeed. I mean, one way to understand the work that we do is to sort of realize the fact that we're bringing people together in community across the country in local context, but also in a national sort of fashion. So, because of the magic of Zoom and web-based technology, we're able to, of course, bring people together in real time across geography and so forth. And not just in sort of live Zoom-based programs and conversations, but, in people's sort of relationship with the Braver Angels podcast, subscribing to the newsletter, being a part of the sort of media content that we generate, consuming that, sharing that. This sort of narrative approach to saying that red and blue, left and right ultimately complete one another in an American experiment that's based on the idea that is e pluribus unum, that out of many we are one, right? As aspirational and even naive sounding a notion as that might be to people in the present moment, we do come from the premise which says that ultimately we need each other in an inclusive fashion to make democracy work, that we can't make democracy work excluding one another, right? Not just in terms of voting rights, but even in terms of our ability, again, to connect with and relate to each other. Our work is about bringing people into a community that sort of affirms that, at least as an aspiration and something that we get to by modeling internally, right? But the idea is not just to sort of model that in one-off conversations, but in the programs that Randy mentioned, in our Red Blue workshops and our debate programs, in our skills training workshops where people learn effective means of communicating and empathizing across the divide, and through very many other formats, people are developing skills and attitudes and cultivating new norms for political and social discourse and behavior that they then take with them back out across the social and institutional landscape, right? Attitudes, perspectives, and habits that they take with them back to their college campus, back to their business or place of work, back to their church, back to their local community, back to their local government, even back to their kitchen table, right? All while being plugged in to a larger sort of national community and growing movement, which seeks to sort of, articulate this idea that, again, the success of democracy is based on our ability to trust one another in a spirit of goodwill, and that we can only get to that point by modeling that, by being willing to go first, in empathizing with each other across the divide. So in that way, although it is activity that is spurred forth by a lot of spontaneity and grassroots volunteerism, community momentum, it's also part of a larger sort of structure of social impact, which reaches out across institutions, across geography, across demography, and across the political spectrum, changing and reorienting the way we interact with each other.
So what is or that you're seeing the biggest trust issue between people and their government and each other? Maybe it's not one thing, but
yeah, I don't think it's one thing. I mean, it's certainly, going to be one thing more than the other.
What are you seeing the most of?
Right?
What's coming to the top?
Well, I mean, right now, it's hard not to put, Roe versus, not to put the issue of abortion, sort of right up at the top of that list. That's just so fresh right now. We're here speaking just a few days after Roe v. Wade was overturned, and millions of Americans who thought they had a certain constitutional right that's deep and intimately sort of held now feel that sort of pulled from under them. On the other hand, you've got millions of Americans who for years and years been advocating for a change in our society that's just a deeply entrenched moral commitment, moral and of course even religious for many millions of Americans. And they are overjoyed, but it just reinforces this long-standing reality that we're operating largely separate universes, morally and epistemologically and so on and so forth. And so what I would say is that it's not a single issue, but that each individual issue finds itself kind of wrapped up in packaging where it's really the conflict of the identities we have that are somewhat composed of the individual issues that find themselves sort of being the fundamental forces in conflict in American society. So, if I'm a conservative, you're a liberal, it may be that, I, hypothetically believe in the Second Amendment and am pro-life, and, you believe in universal health care and climate change. But it's not just that we disagree about the issues, but it's the fact that if you buy into those things, from my vantage point, if I'm polarized, you're somebody who's buying in to a large, federal and maybe global sort of conspiracy to take away my rights and freedoms. And if I believe the things that I just said, I'm somebody who's a part of a larger sort of white supremacist, sort of push in society, right? To disenfranchise people of color, people of different sexual orientations.
Yeah, we generalize we take one piece of information and then we draw an entire picture of the person
absolutely.
based on that one piece of information.
Right.
And it's actually really unfair.
Yeah.
It's incorrect.
Yeah.
As well.
there's a really interesting dynamic that, this process has been underway for decades, really. And I one of the kind of watersheds of what has happened to kind of give each of us our unique feed of media, right? And with the cable television revolution, right, where each person could go to a channel that was uniquely suited to them, right? You no longer had a shared national narrative. Now, with the progression of technology that gives us literally a personal feed of our own information, we are each steeped in exactly what we think is the proper worldview, right? And we constantly are getting information that is reinforcing that worldview. So there's this ironic counterpoint that, you know, we are getting more and more customization of the universe, but our caricatures of one another are more and more flattened, right? So you can only be on one of two teams at this point. Otherwise, you risk being accused of disloyalty or naivete by the folks who you perhaps feel most kindred spirit with.
Sure.
Right. So
you can't even ask questions.
Exactly.
About if you even pose that there may be a difference between what's the news is saying and what you're thinking. You are automatically construed as the opposite of whatever party is being presented.
Right. There. And you could be damaging people by bringing an idea to light and wanting to discuss that idea in more detail. Right. And so it seems like a lot of people, and this is a problem that I think a lot of folks ascribe to the left these days, but there are analogs on the right. Right. So there is a lot of reinforcement of that loyalty that people feel just such pressure to hew to. And it takes a lot of courage to be able to stand up to that. I was watching the Jan 6 committee hearings last night and seeing the testimony that was being given, and in my mind it took such courage for many of the people who were quite loyal deputies of the Trump administration, and they decided, no, this is what I feel is right. I have to come forward. And, careers have been ended because of it, right? But some of the similar kind of things have happened on the left, where people are like, I'm not comfortable with the pressure on free speech that's being brought to bear, especially on college campuses, for example, right? And when people speak out, those careers have been cut short. And I think that as an organization in general, we think that the free exchange of ideas is so important to this country. One of the reasons why when we changed our name, we were originally Better Angels, based on the Lincoln quote, summoning the better angels of our nature. But when we changed our name, the reason we chose Braver Angels is because it takes a lot of courage to engage in these conversations when often there's so much at risk, right? People are risking their relationships, they're risking perhaps their livelihoods. And if people are too scared based on those risks, then we stop having a national conversation. And that is one of the scariest things of all from our perspective, I think.
Yeah, we find ourselves pushing each other out of all of our sort of shared spaces. I mean, I do agree with Randy. I mean, I think that cancel culture is this, essentially something that exists sort of, broadly across the body politic. I think you see it on the left and on the right. If there's an asymmetry, I think it probably comes in the fact that I think sort of left-leaning cultural forces are more predominating in mainstream sort of cultural institutions. And so you're going to find it more in the vehicles that kind of broadcast out across the national landscape, the entertainment industry, obviously, academia and so forth. The culture of the federal government tends to be left-leaning on the level of bureaucrats and so on and so forth. But, if you're talking about, the Southern Baptist Convention, if you're talking about, the culture of small towns, if you're talking about, Republican state parties and central committees censoring folks like Mitt Romney or, kicking out, people from long-standing veterans of the GOP for not hewing the party line and sort of, kissing the ring of Donald Trump and so forth. I mean, you do see that this is something, that exists, I think, pretty widely in American culture. And what it ensures, as progressives push conservatives sort of out of mainstream institutions, as conservatives sort of build up their own sort of parallel infrastructures and so forth, it just reinforces the echo chamber sort of phenomenon and divides our epistemological universe to where, our ability to sort of, show up to reality in the same way becomes as starkly divided as the way Randy and I are dressed right now. It's like people just, showing up to the same party thinking it's a totally different kind of show,
Yeah. None of us are dressed the same, actually.
Right?
Yeah, we coordinated. It was meant to be part of the theme.
I noticed, and just to kind of jump back to your point a little bit and then follow up on yours, like you have to go so far out of your way to get out of the algorithm.
Yeah.
And you have to want to do that, to get out of your echo chamber and to hear other perspectives, because likely your friends think similar than you.
Right.
And the one that doesn't, I've seen this, the few that don't end up sort of not hanging out as much anymore.
Right.
In the family situation, the ones that think differently end up being kind of on the edge, you know. They get, if you're the one person that thinks differently in a crowd of 5, then you're the one person who thinks differently in a crowd of 5. It's like, you know, what's going to happen when people talk, and then so you have to work so hard, and what I always say is you have to watch more of the stuff you disagree with than the stuff you agree with if you want good perspective, because it's easy to find things you agree with. That's really super easy.
Well, and not only is it harder to, you know, the thing is, of course, the algorithm works in a momentum kind of building sort of way, right? We're all inclined to look at the things that affirm our biases and so forth. And so the technology sort of responds to that and continues to feed that to us. I think that when people, you know, you put somebody who's used to watching MSNBC or Pod Save America all day, and you sit them in front of the blaze, it doesn't take but a second to sort of like, you know, for their blood to just start boiling. Same thing going the other way. So, you know, I mean, you're right. You really do have to go out of your way and sort of learn how to get comfortable with views that you're uncomfortable with. Now, you know, I encourage people to do that, but it's difficult. The thing that Braver Angels does is we don't exactly eliminate discomfort, because you can't. On some level, we really are trying to get people to become comfortable with discomfort. And what that does allow for in the right context is an ability to see the humanity in the person coming from the other side in a way that allows you to learn, expand your own perspective, and more effectively represent your own, right? And so you can progress to the point of being more and more comfortable with perspectives you are uncomfortable with. And
seeking those relationships in your life, even.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, seeking those relationships in your life, or being comfortable or more comfortable sort of, you know, tolerating the ones that are already there without the desire to sort of cut off relationships.
Those levels.
Yeah, exactly. Because we damage ourselves when we do that. When we do that, right? Many people have cut people out of their lives who then miss those people, right? But, you know, because we've collapsed your political affiliation into something that we presume to be equal to your moral character, which I would argue it is not. These are not the same things. But because we've drawn this equivalency, we find ourselves forced to make these hard decisions rather than reasoning with each other in a way that can allow us to expand sort of, you know, our understanding of reality. And so, you know, if you just force people to kind of like watch news from the other side of the aisle, I think it's a good thing. But the amazing thing about Braver Angels, it's a good thing for people to have that habit. But the amazing thing about Braver Angels is that, you know, if you're somebody coming from the left, we're not Sean Hannity like shouting at you that, you know, you're a libtard or what have you, you know, for having the point of view that you have. And if you're somebody coming from the right, you know, we're not, you know, I don't know, Cenk Uygur saying that you're a fascist or what have you, you know, for thinking the way that you think.
Isn't there an argument that says like once you compare someone to Hitler, the argument ends? Because
and yet
you can't do that.
And yet it's not that uncommon a thing.
It's very common.
A lot of people just jump to the Nazi.
I've heard both. Obama's Hitler,
you know.
and Trump was Hitler.
Oh yeah, that's right. Everybody's Hitler.
And
both people. How can they both be Hitler?
Well, and so to John's point, you know, about our emphasis on relationships. You know, I read a book by Chris Bale, Breaking the Social Media Prism, and he actually exploded some misconceptions that we have about our media bubbles, right? And, you know, most people think, oh, well, we're only seeing things that we agree with, which I kind of alluded to before, but isn't exactly right. It's we are also seeing things that we disagree with, but they're framed in a way that is not really helpful for us to understand them. And so so he talked about when people on social media encounter a particularly virulent strain of the other side, a strident point of view, that it doesn't help things, it actually hurts things, right? So encountering other viewpoints has to be in a context of relationship, a context of trust, right? And when you really get to know someone, you start to understand their journey towards how they came to believe what they believe. And, we continually emphasize the power and the value of story, of narrative, right? Because human beings are such a narrative-driven species, right? That's how we understand our entire world. In fact, before we even develop language, toddlers at the end of their day are kind of processing their day in a narrative form and putting themselves into that narrative, right? So when we're able to hear someone's story, it really helps us identify with them, and it helps us to fully understand, or more fully understand at least, their process, and to make them a lot less alien.
Can I pick out one of Randy's points just a second ago, just because I think it's worth underlining? Randy just sort of mentioned the fact that in the partisan media landscape, not only are you, it's not that you never find yourself exposed to the other point of view. Obviously, you have to be exposed to it in some form or fashion, because if not, there's nothing to talk shit about, right? But it is presented to you in a way that...
And that's an imperative, apparently.
That's imperative. No, actually, but it kind of is, though. I mean, we do have a psychological sort of, an impulse towards conflict, right? And an impulse towards, some of this messiness. But the thing I was just going to pull out is that, you oftentimes are getting hit with, straw man versions of the other side, or the most extreme version of the other side, as if that's what's representative of the people and the interests that, you find yourself in opposition to. But, all the research shows, the more in common data from the American Enterprise Institute, and I imagine any number of other sources, that your sort of archetypal conservative or progressive, like the progressive who believes in, you just sort of go down the list, like higher marginal taxes, single payer health care, whether it's, pro-choice, gay marriage, this, that, or the other. The person who checks all those boxes on the left, and the person who's straight down the line, low taxes, market health care, pro-life and pro-gun, this, that, or the other, represents somewhere around 8 to 15% of the people who would actually, identify or affiliate as Republicans or Democrats generally, or vote that way, which means that everybody else is in the middle. By the way, there's nothing wrong, of course, with, checking all those boxes, if that's your point of view. I'm not saying that's the problem. But what is true is that the more partisan people tend to be, the more fully they align, oftentimes the more aggressive and kind of, vitriolic they might tend to be in the way they sort of advocate for their position, the more zero-sum their kind of social engagement with people on the other side of the aisle is. And my only point here is just that we get the sense that everybody's an asshole on the other side, right? Because it's the business model of the media and the prevailing political establishment to make you think that. But that's not true. I don't think it's true of regular folks. I don't even think it's necessarily true of most of our elected officials and so forth. But all of the incentives are there to make you demonize people in that way.
It's squeaky wheel syndrome at its best, and it's clickbait, and it's engagement based on conflict. People engage with things
Absolutely.
that are contentious.
Yeah. And to bring this into a context of how our programs actually address this issue. So I have moderated a bunch of red-blue workshops, right? And I don't think I can recall one where someone didn't say at the end, we're a lot closer to one another than I realized. And what they also say is that my side is less monolithic than I thought. We have a lot more diversity of opinion, right? And so that flattening gets completely destroyed, and people's understanding of the variety of viewpoint on either side of the issue is brought into full, vibrant color by these workshops. Sometimes, we get a criticism. Well, isn't your red-blue framing inherently itself divisive? And we have to explain. Well, when you're trying to address an issue, you have to name that issue, right? You have to actually look it in the face and say, well, the issue here is that people have these skewed, very stereotypical, very flat understandings of people who they often don't know at all, right? And so you bring those people specifically together. That's why we have people identify, at least in the red-blue workshops and our discussion workshops, right? And not all of our programs actually do this, but you bring those folks together to go through exercises like the stereotypes exercise, where they say, this is the stereotype that you have of us, And this is why it's unfair. But also, this is how we can be self-reflective, and we can actually own maybe a little of a kernel of truth of that stereotype and understand why you see us this way, right? So it's just so powerful because it lends that color and texture to one another, but it also is an incredible act of good faith between the two sides in terms of being vulnerable. And that is some of the biggest power, I think, of those programs.
It's amazing that you've done, so much work around this and have seen the reactions of people, what happens and what is possible when we realize that it's not our values and aspirations that are in question. Because I believe, and from what I've seen, it is basically the same. Everyone wants their kids to go to a good school and have good education for the country, and no one wants to have mental illness and homelessness, right? Like, we all want to take care of people, and especially all the people in the middle who are getting caught into the clickbait and that squeaky wheel is what's driving the conversation, and it happens at a local level on local issues too. Yeah. Right. Just on basic stuff, like even anything that we deal with, in Santa Monica, for example, there's people, and a lot of it's just because people have time to do it as well. It's difficult to be someone in your 20s, 30s, 40s and have the time to be involved at a local level. Sure. And take that and do that community service and volunteer effort. You're trying to build a career, a family. It's hard. And a lot of that starts to create an imbalance in the concept of democracy, period. You say, well, if these are all the voices that we're listening to, and all of them are the activists, say, then where are the voices of the people that really are thinking somewhere in the middle?
Yeah. You make a good point. Part of the issue we struggle with at Brave Angels is the fact that, while our programs touch a sort of a more diverse range of people, the folks who are able to sort of volunteer and work with us on a regular basis, and very grateful for them, right? So don't get me wrong, but they do tend to be more sort of middle to upper class, more educated, and closer to their retirement years and so forth. Now there are a couple of organizations, namely one in particular who we work with on campuses called Bridge USA, which have done a phenomenal job sort of, mobilizing Gen Z in this kind of work, right? But, that's an issue we face within Brave Angels, but broadly speaking, across the body politic, your point is well taken too. I mean, when I was running, this is actually an interesting thing. You've made me think about something for the first time. When I was running for office, so I ran as a Republican for Congress way back in 2014. And I was the vice chairman of the LA GOP for, a couple of years or so. And I back then I used to really wish there was an organization like Brave Angels, because when I was speaking to, folks in neighborhoods, in churches, communities, sorts of context, generally speaking, people are very reasonable, whether they're left or right, and were willing to sort of engage and listen. And they tended to, have their leanings, but also tended to be more practical, more pragmatic a lot of times than they were ideological, or at least that's the way they wanted to be, right? But in terms of people who are like organized to sort of make social change, those environments tended to be much more sort of polarized, radicalized. And of course, in the Republican Party, you've got, a lot of folks who are generally sort of older, who might have more time for this sort of volunteer work, who are also very polarized and great people so much of the time, right? But, just sort of in a state of mind to where it's kind of difficult to really see what the other side is saying. And I think of the Democratic Party, you have something similar that happens on the other end of the demographic spectrum, because you've got people who may have a little bit of bandwidth owing to the fact that, you're college students, and, it's not to say you're not having to, work hard at school and so forth, but maybe you've got enough of the pressure taken off of you to where you don't have as much pressure to pay the bills as you would if you, were a working class person with a family of 3 or 4 or 5. And there's also kind of a social economy that evolves around activism, where you kind of like scale that a bit by being the person who's sort of like most unrelenting or most unyielding, in your advocacy for, racial justice or gender justice or whatever the case may be. So we have these social economies that kind of grow up. And to be simplistic, I think it's a little bit more for older people on the right, a little bit more for younger people on the left. but very little incentive for anybody to sort of meet in the middle or listen to each other across that divide. One, because of the nature of the polarizing, just sort of, polarization industry, if you will. But, two, because they are not necessarily as grounded in the day-to-day sorts of concerns of just regular sort of like, working folks who got to think much more about making, about things just working in their, day-to-day lives rather than winning culture wars, right? And so I think that things kind of break out in that way as well.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and you made a good point there around the impetus to solve this problem isn't necessarily there. And, I guess what's really interesting to me is that when you think about all that we know, and I think most people would agree that the news and media portray these extremes. The clickbait problem is real. The contentious engagement problem is real. They know that advertisers fund the media agencies as well. So there's some relationship there, right? Like people know this, right? But when they get their information, I'll throw one more. Bots, AI, the level of information and curation that has to be done to get a well-balanced perspective on any issue, and still you'll never get to 100%, right?
Right.
But to me, it seems wild that people don't in general, have the humility to say, you know what, I understand that, because they do understand that. Right. But when it comes to having the staunch belief that they have about what the thing they just read, the article they read, and get enraged and then name call, ad hominem attacks at people, and go up and yell at people, and then destroy relationships of friends and family because of this thing they saw in the news that they thought was all objective truth, which is almost impossible to get to the bottom of, and no one knows is in the room where it happens. We can't even get to the bottom of like the politics of the development at 4th and Arizona at Santa Monica. There's so much reality TV around, like even at the most local level stuff, and people think they understand what's going on in the room of these federal politicians. International leaders in rooms.
And we constantly have to reinforce to people in our workshops that, we are swimming in a different sea of facts, every single person, right? So that it is a very common lament from folks on both the left and the right that the other side doesn't care about facts. They just are focusing on their emotions. And it's basically the exact same argument.
Right.
And we have to reinforce that, well, first of all, emotions are a constant presence in human communication. That is undeniable. You can't separate that out, right? You have to actually, I listened to your pod with the city manager, that you did recently, and you were talking about like people lose sight of the fact that we're all human beings, right? And we're not just fact machines that are regurgitating what we hear online. We have all of these experiences that we have to bring to bear, right? But people say, yes, I totally understand that. I totally understand that that I have seen things that someone else hasn't, and vice versa. But they always come back to because in the moment, as you said, right, we hear something and you're like, how could someone else possibly hear this, right? And of course, we're hearing it right now with the January 6th hearings, right? From a lot of blues who are like, this has to change everything, right? How could someone watch this and not be totally convinced? Right. That
the story is 100% clear and zero uncertainty.
Exactly. And part of that is a function of the fact that it is that there are not Trump supporters on the committee. I happen to believe, I lean blue, and I happen to believe that the committee is making an airtight case that the other side can't really rebut. But the fact is, we do have to recognize that there is some information that they're not motivated to include, right? And we always have to be thinking about that.
Yeah. What's the agenda? What's the motivation of anyone doing this? Period. Right. You have to dissect that. And January 6th is a tricky one because there is a lot of this kind of compelling things that are happening, and and a lot of people are watching that. It's also a very hot topic right now.
Yeah.
But yes, it does seem like there's no way to see a possibility of someone who thinks differently. And there are still, even with this, millions and millions of our friends and neighbors of this country who see things a little bit differently. They're looking at it from they get different news, they're reading different stories, testimonials, whatever, and those are not presented here. And it makes it's not to say whether it's right or wrong, but you have to say if you want to solve the problem, and let's say it's 100% truth in this case, that this happened, January 6th was as presented in the hearings. If you want to know why people feel the way they do and what, you have to ask them and dive deep into that conversation and say, what are you, let's lay out the information that we're reading here and tell me why, because if I want to in the future make things a certain way in this country, I have to understand what the other side, what is the argument that I'll have to get over, even if I want to win a certain policy or whatever.
And you have to make sure that you don't have preconditions going into that conversation, right? So around this specific issue, there's so many blues who say, well, if someone is not willing to simply accept the fact that this was an insurrection, then, I mean, how could I possibly talk to them, right?
Right.
And if you're going to put,
you have to not believe in science.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, if you're going to put a precondition on your willingness to even talk to somebody, then odds are the conversation is never going to start, and we're not actually going to make the progress that you're hoping that you can convince this person to change their entire worldview, but you're unwilling to even come to the table unless they are already partly there.
Right. So you're right and they're evil.
Well,
right.
and yeah, right. And by the way, that's also something that you hear on each side. Actually, what I used to hear on each side was, we think that they're wrong, but they think that we're evil. Although I'm afraid that these days it might be tipping a little more towards, no, actually, you know what, maybe they are evil. But no, but to your point, Evan, Randy, I think that possibly the most controversial thing we've ever done at Braver Angels was be willing to hold actual debates and discussions on the subject of, voter fraud, voter suppression, but including the point of view that the 2020 election really was stolen by fraud. Because we've got members at Braver Angels who believe that. We might have a member of staff or two. I'm not sure, but that's a view that's present within our community, and from our vantage point, that's a good thing. Not because I agree with that view necessarily, but because, as Randy said, you got to be able to name the divisions and the polarities that exist in America if we're going to be able to set the stage for an honest conversation that can allow us to, one, reason our way towards truth, but to do that from a vantage point of interpersonal trust. Like, I may not right off the bat agree with what you have to say, Evan, but if I think but Evan, he's a good guy, he means well, I'm going to at least be willing to listen to you, right? And I'm going to be comfortable sharing my point of view with you.
But that's the precondition that needs to be set before you have that conversation.
Well, precisely. And I think that folks who feel that the way to combat dangerous sort of, misinformation is to make sure that nobody who holds any of these views has a platform. I think that it's sort of like, I don't know, sweeping all the dirt under the rug and then saying the room is clean, It's more that you sort of hid the problem from your line of sight. But it's out there, it's the dust is there in the air, you're breathing it in. And ultimately, it's going to come back around in the next election. It's going to poison people's trust in the larger sort of democratic system unless you actually engage their arguments and their points of view. And if you have the truth, then you might actually be able to reach people with it.
Right.
But, the thing that people will tell you is, but if people don't listen to facts, what does it matter? And our response to that is basically that, it's not necessarily the case that people are unavailable to facts. They're unavailable to facts when they do not trust the people who have the facts or who presume to have the facts. And they will not trust those people unless they feel that those people actually mean them well. And they will never feel that those people mean them well if those people relentlessly traffic in stereotypes towards them. And so, or otherwise demonizing them for just, for the way they come at the issues. And so, people may again sort of say, yeah, but they demonize us. And, my response to that is just like, well, you know what? That's kind of like the eye for an eye thing that leaves the whole world blind. At a certain point, somebody's got to be willing to go first and showing a little bit of grace here, and try to empathize at least with how people feel, even if you don't feel their reasoning, you know? Because, you got to break that cycle. That's what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
We're trying to break that cycle of mistrust and contempt.
Yeah. There was a really powerful idea in the book from Steven Pinker from a few years ago. He actually wrote it in 2011, I think, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which obviously is something that, we Steven Pinker has worked with us, and we, value his perspective. And I mean, this book reframed a lot of things for me, about the arc of human history and the way that we have related to one another. I think it's a really important thing. There's a lot of really important things in there to understand. One of them that he framed up was when societies are moving past really traumatic experiences, collective experiences, like civil wars, like genocides, like apartheid, right? The key to actually moving past that sort of trauma is for at least one side, as John said, to take the step first, to recognize that there will be no perfect justice, right? If we demand perfect justice, well, that often comes at the expense of the other side, and we may feel that that's right, but the other side is not going to see it exactly the same way that we do, and there's going to be a cycle of recrimination, and that other side is going to demand to be compensated in a certain way, and you have basically a cycle that never ends. So you really do have to accept the idea that that imperfect justice is a worthy goal, and that understanding one another, establishing those relationships, can be the bridge that it takes to accept that you're not going to get perfect justice. You're not going to be made perfectly whole by a solution. And that has to be okay, because there's no way for anyone to be perfectly whole in this, absurdly complicated world of the human condition in which we exist.
Yeah. Striving towards utopia is great, but one of the things, and you make a really important point that's very manifest locally, and even more so federally, I believe, when you start extrapolating how far this can reach. But when you win something 50-50, well, no, you couldn't win 49-51. When you win something 51-49, that's not really a win. What you did was beat the game,
right?
But you lost 49%, and those people, in a lot of different issues, are angry, and they will come back and be like, and think that that's a loss for them, and now that they have to go fight harder on the next one, and they hold that deep. It's part of their egoic existence, right? It's part of like, I can't believe they took that from me,
right? And when something like Roe happens, we're seeing it in real time right now. That each side is being mobilized. The conservatives are being mobilized to, now we can go all the way, right? Now we can make sure that abortion can never be illegal in anywhere in this country, right? Because they want to press their advantage and
use it on other issues,
right? Absolutely. And of course the liberals and progressives are, this is going to be the issue of mobilization in the midterm elections, right? And so it will be that kind of ping pong effect. And one of our workshop participants said something to the effect of, we have to accept that we're never going to vanquish the other side, right? So we might as well learn how to work together so we can advance this country. And that's something that once people kind of hear it, they're like, oh yeah, that is kind of true. Like I'm not going to defeat them, right? They're not going to just go away. If I manage to mobilize enough people in my base, right? So what does that mean practically? And so what I always try to emphasize, especially when it comes to the most passionate supporters and activists behind a cause or behind a political philosophy, is that I recognize I share a lot of those passions, right? And I feel very strongly about what is right and what is wrong, and the path that we should be taking as a country. But when it comes to the practicality of it, when it comes to, a lot of progressives talk about impact versus intent, and that it's impact that matters, even if you don't intend something to be harmful. But they don't seem to think about it in a practical sense, that the impact that they are having by demonizing the other side and by making it impossible for even many of their own former allies to join their cause because they've been cast out and they have been deemed irredeemable, right? The impact of that is that they are shooting themselves in the foot and they are undercutting their own goals. And so as an organization, we welcome people from all over the political spectrum. As John mentioned, there does tend to be a critical mass of folks who are constitutionally kind of moderate and want to naturally kind of reach across the aisle, right? But one of the challenges is to communicate with the most passionate and the most strident that no, there's a more effective way that you can be advocating for what you believe in, and that is the Braver Angels way.
Yeah.
For me, it's something that's also deeply inspired by Dr. King's philosophy of nonviolence. And so part of what Martin Luther King Jr. taught was that we must pursue peace by means of peace, right? And that, we must pursue social change in a way that allows us to ultimately put ourselves on a path towards reconciling with our enemies, right? The idea being that we do not wish to defeat or humiliate them so much as win their trust and friendship. Now, the thing is that Dr. King was not somebody who at the same time retreated an inch from speaking the truth, from speaking it firmly, speaking it righteously, right? And so that's the balance that has to be struck. Because, people oftentimes say, well, look, how can I, commit to the work of depolarization without moderating my position or whatnot, or making myself less effective? But you make yourself more effective, when you're able to lean into truth with passion in a way that also shows that you're taking the moral high ground, right? Because suddenly, even if somebody disagrees with you, they have a more difficult time aligning your character or thinking that your opposition to them is something personal as opposed to principled, right? So, if you're coming from a place of principle and good intentions, I can respect you and I probably have to listen to you, whereas I can sort of write you off a little bit, again, if you're just somebody who I can easily kind of characterize as a cartoon character or some kind of villain, So, part of our challenge is to show that the work that we do is empowering to people's ability to sort of advocate and articulate, not disempowering.
Yeah.
But that's just part of our own challenge here.
Well, it's creating a culture also at a large scale, right? Mm-hmm. You're creating, and good cultures are built on safety, building safety between each other, having vulnerability and purpose, right? Sharing that vulnerability, and knowing that those people are not bad people because they think differently than you. And if you look at how you have to shift a culture to feel comfortable, I mean, there's just, there's a lot of aspects to this that just make it super challenging. And for me, it still comes back to I almost want to set the conversation where it's all right, if we're going to engage in a political conversation, let's recognize that we have to lay one definitions down. Yeah. That's one that's crazy. People don't even know the same words. Right. And then you argue about a thing and you don't even have the same lexicon.
Right.
That's literally two different languages. You can't even get past fact. What is a fact? That's a conversation. It shouldn't be a conversation what a fact is, but it is.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
And then whatever that fact is, I've heard someone say, a fact, I get all the information I can, and then I make an opinion.
I mean, we
are you saying that? So what's your take on that way of approaching things? Gathering information and rendering your opinion. Are you saying that that's not the way to do it?
Well, I've heard. Well, then that would lead it to me that your opinion is a fact.
Right.
Yeah. They're offering that as a definition of the word fact.
Definition of the word fact, correct.
Okay.
Right. Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Right.
Well, and so what this gets to, man, is the fact that, facts and the interpretation of facts are different things, right? And so, we might actually disagree on what the facts are. And then it becomes a question of, what are our sources? How are we arriving at our information? And, that can be a complicated enough, conversation as it stands. But then there's, the question of how are we interpreting facts, right? And all sorts of priors come into that. And so, it's really, people act like facts are the issue. I think that that's kind of overblown on a certain level. I mean, yes, there's an issue with facts and arriving at credible information. It's made complicated by social media, so on and so forth. But I'll give you an example just because this has been on my mind because people are talking about 2,000 Mules and Dinesh D'Souza and so forth. But I remember, Dinesh D'Souza's, his first blockbuster documentary, Obama's America. Where he sort of lays out this picture of Barack Obama. And, I worked for Obama's campaign way back in the day. I became a Republican, someone more conservative leaning. Got a lot of criticisms of Barack Obama's policies and so forth. But D'Souza looked at the fact that, Barack Obama was the first president with sort of $1 trillion debts and $1 trillion deficit. And, he identified that as a fact in his documentary, and that was a fact. Like Obama, he definitely, presided over, serious, financial shortfalls, right? But then D'Souza's interpretation of that fact was remarkable. If you do the math, and, I think you can say Obama spent too much money and what have you. I think there are legitimate economic criticisms of the Obama administration.
Who hasn't?
Yeah, right. Well, exactly. Who hasn't?
Isn't that the nature of becoming president? You just spend too much money.
Pretty much. And you can say Obama was worse than most, but he came into office with a $400 billion tax tax shortfall because of the recession. If you look at the numbers, mandatory spending, I'm getting wonky here, but mandatory spending on things like Medicare and Social Security each increased over the course of his 4 years or so by about $2 trillion or whatnot. And then, he spent $1 trillion on the stimulus package, or, 800 some odd billion on the stimulus package. And, that was to counter the recession. If Republicans had been in office, they would have cut taxes possibly by about that much, right? Bottom line being that any Democrat or Republican president would have had $1 trillion deficit and would have added trillions of dollars to the national debt. And there might have been, some real difference at the margins, but anybody was going to do that. But D'Souza took that fact and instead contextualized it through the prism of Barack Obama's father, who was a Kenyan socialist government official, and the fact that, Obama had somebody who had sort of like left-wing associations and sympathies for, for like social justice causes on the left. And D'Souza's interpretation of the debt was Obama is deliberately driving us into debt so as to make America economically equal with the third world. Like that was Dinesh D'Souza's interpretation of those facts, right?
Right.
So like, D'Souza is here, like we would agree on the facts, but Jesus, like where's the interpretation like coming from, But this is why we got to understand sort of like where we're coming from. And it can get complicated when you're talking about people and authority and influence who have other sorts of, structural kind of incentives for, pushing a certain line. I mean, if you're going to make millions of dollars, with a TV show or a documentary or whatnot, that can make it a little bit difficult to back out of a certain, certain narrative.
Sure.
Right. And so these things all have to be taken into consideration. But just to say that interpretation of facts is the key thing here, not just facts in and of themselves.
Facts and the interpretation.
Right.
Yeah. And there's Daniel Kahneman's book, which is one of my favorites, Thinking Fast and Slow.
Uh-huh.
If you read that book, at least my experience was that you start to you're so wary of your own judgment.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many cognitive biases
right.
that filter your thought process. Being emotional is like one thing.
Yeah.
There's recency, frequency, how it, what's that?
Availability,
how intense something happened. It's like all of these things, the social aspect to things. It's something like 50 or 100 of them.
Right. And many of those which were actually quite valuable to us in an evolutionary sense, right?
Yeah, and still are in a lot of ways.
There's rationality behind how our brains kind of filter the world and interpret it.
Yeah.
But in so a lot of people saw the documentary The Social Dilemma,
right?
And of course Tristan Harris, I think he was the one who quoted someone's quote from decades ago that talked about that human beings have Paleolithic brains and medieval institutions and godlike technology, right? And so we can't evolve our brains fast enough to deal with the environment that we're in now, right? And of course now we are dealing with things like deep fakes, right? And technology that has vastly overtaken our ability to kind of keep it framed up in our heads about what it's doing to us, right? So it does seem like the arc of danger in terms of human history is amping up, right? And that we absolutely need to figure out how to rein in this technology and not necessarily put Pandora's box, close it back up, but really to adjust the incentives. I think that that social media companies, other media companies have, in terms of, people often talk about deplatforming others. I have a pretty unpopular view among my fellow liberals and progressives that Donald Trump should not have been kicked off of Twitter, right? And because what happens there is that he and other demagogues, in my belief, right, they go into more enclosed spaces where the people who support them are in a bubble of reinforcement, and those who kicked them off the platform no longer have any influence.
It actually reinforces echo chambers.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so from in my mind, what we should be focusing on is, well, one of the main reasons that we're faced with this problem is because the incentive structure of social media in general is about chasing the highest engagement, and the highest engagement is always going to be anger, right? And so basically there is this built-in structure, and people talk about the like button, which kind of did the opposite, but now we have other reactions. We have the anger reaction literally in Facebook, right? And so that is a constant reinforcement of
what could go wrong,
right? An amplification of the angriest voices, right? And so we have to rethink that at the same time that we're trying to, rethink how we kind of relate to one another face to face.
Yeah. Oh, the challenge is ahead.
It's a crazy world.
Yeah,
it's a crazy world.
So I know we're getting close to the end. I did want to mention, I know that you've been very involved in, building your community in Santa Monica, and listening to the pod with the city manager. Like I get a sense that I was impressed with his approach to things, his equanimity, right, in the face of some of the trends that we've seen. I work with a lot of our partners who come to us, like corporations, other organizations that are being affected by this new vitriol that is invading formerly non-political spaces, right? And so we have several initiatives that are really focused on that. One of them is called Braver Politics, that we want to help our political leaders engage in better conversations, but it's also just regular public officials, right? The folks who are running departments, municipal departments and school board members, right? Who are experiencing this vitriol like they've never experienced before. But we also have a program called Braver Communities that, in Cincinnati, for example, we are taking every angle that we possibly can and throwing it at the wall, seeing what sticks, right? Seeing how many institutions that we can engage in a community, be they religious institutions, corporations, nonprofits, any sort of organization that has a stake in that community. And I think that, the way that you're engaging with your community it's kind of reminiscent of that, right? Like I see you talking to all of these different stakeholders, right? And trying to get their take on how we can actually improve the dynamic.
I think what Randy's trying to say, Evan, is, are you interested in a job? You can always use the battlements with
That's very kind of you. That's very kind of you. I appreciate that. I do believe that if we can make politics human, because I don't think most people think of politicians like humans.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right? Or even people at the city very often, regular people. right? And there's a lot of issues with like city bureaucracy and like how things get done and process, and like there's tons of it. But like if we can make people human, they can be authentic, we can have these conversations, we could start to see that they're people too, then I think it'll create an ecosystem of trust. And I'd like to, I believe that what you're doing does that. What Braver Angels does that. And that's, my intention. I think there's a lot of good people out there. Not every politician is a great person, but there are, and I know a bunch that are good people, and they get, I think they can bring, if they can bring their world to the level of the regular citizen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
We don't know what happens there.
Yeah.
They need to bring that to us and not make it such a black box, and be a human and authentic and show and talk about their kids. And that's,
make genuine connection,
building safety and vulnerability.
Yeah. Well,
absolutely.
More to talk about on that front. I mean, because, that is part of what our work aims at, too. Specifically, Randy mentioned braver politics. And so, we're addressing particularly, local elected officials across the country in just that kind of a spirit.
Yeah.
So, man.
I loved this. This was wonderful. Thanks so much for doing this and taking the time.
Definitely.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Well, let's not have this be the last conversation.
I love it.
Absolutely.
I love it. Let's do a mid. How about a 3-person high five in the middle?
All right.
Does that work? Okay, here we go. 1, 2, 3.
I think John got crowded out.
Did you want to try it again? One more time. 1, 2, 3. That was better. That was better. Second try.
All right.
Fast learning curve. There we go. All right, guys.
All right.
Thank you.
Pleasure.